Hi everyone, Peter here from Movement and Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be covering eccentric overload strength training for athletic performance and why the eccentric muscle contractions are actually going to be significantly important for improving our athletic performance. So to start this one off, we need to take a look at the force-velocity curve, or the force-velocity relationship. And if you haven't sort of understood this yet, basically, what it's saying is this is the velocity on this axis. So this is concentric. As soon as we get to zero, we start getting negative. So that's eccentric. Essentially, the higher the velocity, the lower the force that can be produced. So if you think of something like a back squat or a bench press or some traditional lift, to make it really simple, the closer we are to our 1 rep max, so with higher forces, the slower it's going to be able to move. But the lower the load, so the lower the force, the higher the velocity we're able to move it. So we're able to move the bar a lot faster. However, that's traditional concentric and eccentric lifts sort of only cover this part of the force velocity curve. But if we start getting past basically into negative velocity, that's when we're talking about the eccentric portion of muscle contractions. So we can actually handle heavier loads simply by only performing the eccentric contraction, even though we can't perform the concentric. So think about if we load a squat bar up to 120% of your 1 rep max, then you might be able to go down with it, but we won't be able to stand up with it. So that's when we're tapping into the eccentric part of the force velocity curve. So essentially the take home message here is that when we use eccentric contractions, we can actually handle heavier loads than if we do both concentric and eccentric contractions in the lift. So with that being said, we can do movements that have an eccentric overload to it, that being that we're actually in this half of the force velocity curve. So we can perform exercise that only have the eccentric portion of the lift, so that we can actually use super maximal loads. So loads that we can't use, that we can't actually lift concentrically. So some examples of that are probably the most common is the Nordic hamstring exercise shown in this picture here, where basically you're lowering yourself down as low as you can possibly go, and then you won't be able to actually lift yourself back up unless you're extremely strong. So that's one example. And if you can lift yourself up, then you would hold some weight to make that loading even more. Another example is if you have access to a Smith machine, you can do like a single leg basically squat on the way down to a box or a certain height, and then you can stand up with both legs, so that on the way down you have that eccentric overload on one leg, but then on the way up you're using both legs, so it's a lot easier, so you can stand up with it. Another example similar to that is a single leg eccentric calf raise, and again, so you basically hold some sort of heavy load or use a machine with a heavy load, basically perform the eccentric portion, then at the bottom use both legs to do the concentric portion of the calf raise. And that way we're getting the eccentric overload on one leg at a time. And then some sort of new technology, a flywheel machine, is going to allow eccentric overload in various lifts. And so why is this important, doing strength training with an eccentric overload? And the reason here is because athletic movements like running, jumping, cutting, and throwing, they involve an absorption of force before the explosive propulsion. So essentially what that sentence is saying is a bit confusing, but the absorption of force is the eccentric contraction, whereas the propulsion of the force is the concentric contraction. So if we have a look at these guys, they're basically going to be assuming they're doing lateral bounds in and out of these hoops. So let's say this guy is about to jump into this hoop here. Before he actually, let's say he's going to jump straight into that one. Before he jumps into that one, he actually has to absorb all the landing force before he can then propel himself into the next one. So there's a short absorption phase, which is the eccentric phase, and then there's the propulsion phase, which is when he's actually jumping. So basically having greater eccentric strength is going to basically benefit that absorption. So it's going to allow more force to be absorbed faster and with more control. So essentially, if he can reverse that, if he can basically absorb that force before propelling himself quicker, he can then essentially be more explosive off that contraction, and he can use more of the elastic properties of the muscle tendon unit. So it's necessary to actually absorb that force before we can apply the concentric force. So the faster and more control we can do that with, the more efficient and greater our athletic performance will be. And then, as just mentioned, it's going to allow greater use of the stretch shortening cycle, because if we can absorb that force really rapidly and be really stiff, essentially our muscles almost don't even do much of an eccentric contraction. It's almost an isometric contraction if we're really strong, and then basically most of that concentric propulsion is going to come from the elastic properties of the muscle tendon unit, and then also concentric contractions of those muscles. So that's it for this presentation, guys. Hopefully you got something out of it. You can follow Movement and Performance on Facebook and on Instagram with the details here. And you can also subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already to stay up to date with the latest informative videos that are posted. On social media, so on Facebook and Instagram, you'll find these research infographics, which are essentially the latest research summarized into these easy to understand graphics, so that you can stay up to date with the latest research in sports performance training. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you got something out of this presentation.